Okay, so we're going to review ecology today. So if you're studying ecology, you're studying living and non-living interactions in the environment. So like if you have a pond, you're going to have abiotic factors, which are water and temperature of the water, pH, those types of items. And then if you have the biotic factors, you have like the fish and you have the snails and you have the cattails and you have all of the other items. So whenever you have ecology, you have ecologists studying ecology and they're studying the interactions between those non-living factors and those living factors. So water temperature is going to be an abiotic factor. Whenever you're studying ecosystems, and the person that does that would be ecologist, you're going to have a lot of population dynamics. So you're going to have population sizes changing. So for instance, if you have a hawk that eats a mouse, and that's its main type of food for this particular hawk, then if you have more of those hawks, then you're going to have the mouse population go down. You have different types of ecosystems. You will have terrestrial ecosystems, which are on land, and you will have water ecosystems, which are marine or aquatic, would be the two names you would need to know for that. Of course, the place an organism lives, like in that pond, is going to be its habitat. And then you're going to have relationships within ecosystems. So any type of relationship, and this is a review question, any type of relationship between two organisms would be a symbiosis. And then if you had a relationship where both organisms benefit, that's going to be mutualism. If you have a relationship where one benefits and one is neither harmed nor benefited, you're going to have commensalism. So you have to know all those types of symbiosis. You also have predation, which is where, like if a hunter killed a deer, that's predation. So you need to know all those relationships, and those are a review. If you're talking about food chains versus food webs, you have a food chain which shows energy levels and transfer from one energy level to the next, and organisms do that by eating other things. So you have the producers, and then you have primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and you also have decomposers. So you have food chains, which are one straight line representation, and then you have food webs. And a food web, of course, is going to be a better representation of all of those energy transfers. Whenever you're looking at ecologists and you're looking at models, they use ecological pyramids to show you biomass and the amount of biomass. So when you look at an ecological pyramid, you're going to have more biomass at the bottom where the producers are than you're going to have at the top. And at the top, you're going to have the tertiary consumers, and there's going to be less of those than you would have producers at the bottom. So an ecological pyramid is going to show that the largest amount of biomass is going to be at the bottom. Which of the following are limiting factors? Light, soil quality, water, or all of those? Anything that's going to limit the size of a population is going to be a limiting factor. So in that question, it's going to be all of the above. If an ecosystem changes over time, you've got different types of succession. So you have primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is the example I gave you in class about the pond that was there and then it dried up and then it reappeared. And secondary succession is going to be more like when you have a natural disaster that destroys an area like Hurricane Katrina, and then over time that area will build back up. Speaking of Hurricane Katrina, and if you're near the ocean or you're in any type of water or aquatic or marine habitat, you're going to see differences in water. So you're going to have colder water that's going to be deeper and warmer water that's going to be closer to the surface. And if you have water that's like around here in a creek, if you have water overturning near rocks, you're going to have a lot of oxygen there. So you're going to probably find more fish around that area. So turbulent water is going to have more oxygen, and that's what trout around here are going to like. We talked about rainforest, and we talked about the layers of the rainforest in class. So if you have the bottom, you're going to have the forest floor, and then the next layer up is the understory. And then you're going to have the canopy, which is where you're standing in the forest and you're looking up and you see all those trees blocking out the light. So that's canopy. And then if you flew over in a plane, you would see these trees that would stick out the top. That would be the tallest trees. And those would be your emergence. So you have forest floor, then you have understory, then you have canopy, and then you have emergence. If you're looking at the rainforest, you're going to have a lot of leaching because you have a lot of rain. So the topsoil is going to have a lot of nutrients that get washed really deep. So those trees can live there because they have deeper roots. But if you were to try to plant like potatoes or garden crops there, it wouldn't work as well because the topsoil doesn't have as great a quality there because of leaching. If you're at the ocean and you're looking at organisms, what is the zone between the low tide and the high tide called? that's going to be called the intertidal zone. And if you're in an area where you have what I called in class salty freshy water, that's going to be brackish water, and that's going to exist in estuaries. And we talked about the sound side, we talked about the brackish water area in the estuaries, and that about 90% of your ocean life is going to live really at some point in time in that estuary or utilize it. And of course, when we talked about the ecological pyramid, what is the amount of living matter or total weight of organisms in an area? That's going to be biomass. We talked about growth curves in class, and humans exhibit what type of growth curve? J-shaped, S-shaped, or boom or bust. Humans are going to be exponential or J-shaped curve, and if you have insects or mosquitoes, they're going to exhibit boom or bust because their population size is going to go way up and then way down. If you have an aquarium, we use some examples in class. If you have an aquarium and you put too many fish in and they start to die, that means your aquarium has reached its carrying capacity. Of course, if we go back to talking about the rainforest, one of the particular questions that we talked about was, are there resources in the rainforest that could possibly give us medicines? And the answer is yes. If you have a population and they're trapped in a small room and they're together and someone gets a disease in that small trapped room, can the disease spread quickly? And the answer is yes, it can. How long it takes an organism to reproduce, that's going to be your life history pattern. So you're going to have a longer life history pattern for an elephant versus a mosquito. We discussed hurricanes and density independent versus density dependent limiting factors. So a hurricane hits an island, it's not going to care whether you have a large population there or a small population there. It's a density independent limiting factor. And then density dependent is going to be like number of animals in a particular area or number of critters that you try to throw in your aquarium or amount of water or amount of light. That's going to be density dependent. Natality is birth and fatality is death, and they use those for population equations. The time it takes for a bacteria to double its number is called doubling time. Biodiversity is important. We talked about the importance of planting more than just one type of grass seed in your yard, because if one gets a fungus, they could all die. But if you've planted a diverse type of grass seed in your yard, it's going to have more of a chance of surviving. You have threatened species, endangered species, and extinct species. And endangered means they're almost threatened, or threatened means they're almost endangered. Endangered means they're almost extinct. So extinct is going to be they're not going to be anymore. And endangered is going to be that it's almost extinct. And threatened is going to be one level below endangered. We also discussed the varying conditions along the boundaries of an ecosystem. So you have a pasture field and you have the woods and you have the deer that use the woods for cover, and you have the pasture land where they feed on the grass. And you're going to have edge effects along that area where you have the soil that's going to change. So the soil underneath the forest is going to have different components in the soil due to the leaves falling into the soil, etc., than you're going to have over in the grassland. So that's called edge effects. We talked about acid fog being one of the worst types of acid precipitation because it lingers around on trees, and that we here have moderately acidic rain. We talked about DDT and how it threatened the extinction of the bald eagles. And remember, you need to look back at your notes and see what the progression was that caused that. So DDT was the cause of the possible extinction of the bald eagles. We also discussed protected strips of land. Like I told you an example at the Dublin Walmart behind there, they have a little area where birds migrate each year, and that's called a habitat corridor. And remember, I told you to go look up on the internet some pictures of where they put habitat corridors, which are overpasses over roads. Make sure you know what a riparian zone is. That's going to be between the creek and the pasture where you have tall grass and you have lots of frogs and things living there, so you're going to have a riparian zone there. Those are really important. What are greenhouse gases? We discussed in class that everybody talks about carbon, but methane's just as bad. So you have carbon, methane, and ammonia, which are going to be greenhouse gases. And even though we can get too many of those and it can be bad, you still need a certain number of greenhouse gases to be able to survive. The philosophy that you should use resources but preserve some for the future is called what? That's sustainability, sustainable use, sustainable development. We discussed carbon sequestering, where they take a big rig out in the ocean, they try to trap a bunch of carbon and pump it underneath the ocean floor, and that's called carbon sequestering, and that can be good and that can be bad. They thought that was going to be the fix-all for high levels of carbon, and they found out that it can also pose problems. Bacteria and fungus are decomposers, and if you're looking at a food chain, many times people will forget to include the decomposers, but they are an integral part of the food webs and food chains. You need to know the definition of immigration and immigration. Immigration with an E is going to be exiting an area, and immigration with an I is going to be entering an area. If you're looking at a food chain or a food web, you'll have an arrow on there, and that arrow is not really showing you what eats what. It's showing you the energy transfer from one organism to another, and that's called a trophic level. Humans exhibit a population curve that's exponential or J-shaped curve. Of course, you should know the difference between producer, primary consumer, secondary, and tertiary. You should also be aware, and we've discussed in class, that if you're at the ocean and people fill in marshes, that's a bad idea, because the marshes and the sound side are a natural buffer for the ocean water when it rises or when you have flooding. So swamps and bogs and marshes are natural buffers for ecosystems. We also discussed that in ecology and in environmental science, there are a lot of things that people claim that are green, but if you dig deeper, they may not be as green as you think. And we also discussed that on ecological pyramids, where there's more biomass at the bottom, that when you add humans in there, it can sometimes skew what an ecological pyramid is going to look like.